It's about time we actually did a video about Forgotten Realms spoilers. Today we'll be going over 3 new commanders from the set, and we'll be talking about all the top secret jank cards that go super well with them. First off, we have Asmodius the Archfiend. This guy's a lot like Griselbrand, but toned way down. Yet it's still surprisingly good. It turns out that Griselbrand was so unbelievably broken that even a much worse version of him is kinda powerful. Asmodius lets us pay just 3 mana to draw 7 cards. But we don't really draw them because his first ability makes us just exile every card we draw face down. His last ability lets us pay 1 mana and 1 life per card to put all of the exiled cards into our hand. So let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. If you're playing this deck, then you're going to want to make a ton of mana and then gain a ton of life so you can spend your mana and life to draw a ton of cards, and then do something cool and win. So aside from that, we're going to just look at the more interesting stuff you can do with this commander. One thing we can try and do is find a card that can make Asmodius leave the battlefield in response to drawing 7 cards. That way he won't be on the battlefield when we actually draw the cards, so we won't have to exile them. But since he costs 6 mana, this will probably only be worth it if the card we use to get rid of him also brings him back later so we don't have to recast him. The only cheap way to do this that I found was Voyager Staff. This 1 mana artifact lets us pay 2 and sack it to exile a creature and then bring it back on the end step. So if we activate Asmodius' second ability and then exile him in response with the staff, then we'll get to just draw the 7 cards like normal. It's hard to tell if this interaction is actually good or just cute, though, because it's not repeatable, but it does save you 7 life, or maybe even 14 or 21 life if you can activate the card draw ability more than once. Luckily, there are a couple of other ways we can get around Asmodius' first ability. That ability is a replacement effect because it says if we would draw a card, exile it instead. So one way we can bypass it is by using a different replacement effect. The easiest way we can do this is with dredge cards like Stinkweed Imp. Dredge is also a replacement effect because it says instead of drawing a card, you mill some cards and then put the dredge card into your hand. So if you happen to have 7 dredge cards in your graveyard, then you can use Asmodius to dredge 7 times and fill your graveyard super fast. This has some combo potential with a card like Scourge Familiar. If we have enough dredgers in our graveyard, then we can use Asmodeus to put the dredgers into our hand and then discard them to get more mana and do it again. This lets us keep dredging as much as we want until we run out of cards or life. We can also try doing the opposite of this trick. Instead of using a good replacement effect to get around Asmodius' bad one, we can use Asmodius' replacement effect to get around an even worse one. Let's take a look at Possessed Portal, which is a mean card for meanies that says if a player would draw a card, they just don't. It also makes everyone sacrifice a permanent or discard a card every turn. Normally, playing this card brings the game to a screeching halt and basically traps everyone, including yourself, in an eternal, miserable Staxi prison.
You cannot do this forever.
Actually, I can. This is how things are now. You and me, trapped in this moment, endlessly.
Then you will spend eternity dying.
Pain's an old friend.
But if we play this while Asmodius is on the battlefield, then we can still exile our cards with Asmodius and then put them into our hand, so we'll be the only player who can still draw cards. The last thing we can try is using Asmodius' first ability as an upside rather than a downside. While having to put our cards in exile is pretty annoying, it does let us keep our cards in a safe place where they can't be discarded. That means if we have some cards exiled under Asmodius, then we can play cards that make us discard our hand and we'll still have a second hand available afterwards. Cards like Awaken the Erstwhile and Mind Slicer can destroy opponents' hands while leaving us relatively fine, and we can also somewhat get around the downside of Behold the Beyond. If you're feeling really fancy, then you can even try running Memory Jar, which basically lets you draw 7 cards for a turn and then discard all of them. You might be thinking, but why would I play a 5 mana artifact to draw 7 cards when my commander draws 7 cards for 3 mana? That's a fair point. But the good thing about Memory Jar is that you don't have to pay for it and use it on the same turn. Asmodius is a pretty strong commander, so people will probably be trying to kill him on sight, meaning we really want to use him the turn that we play him. Normally, that would require 10 mana, because we need to play him for 6, then pay 3 to exile cards, and then pay 1 to get the cards into our hand. But what if you already have a Memory Jar on the board? Then you can play Asmodeus for 6, and then crack the Memory Jar to exile 7 cards. Then you wait until the end step trigger for Memory Jar resolves, which will make everyone else discard the 7 cards they drew. But you won't have to because your 7 cards are still exiled. Once you get your original hand back, you pay 1 to get the 7 cards you exiled into your hand. So having a memory jar means we only need 7 mana to get immediate Asmodeus value instead of 10 mana, which might be worth it because drawing 7 cards is super powerful. If you want to go really deep, you can also try playing Blood Scrivener, which lets us draw 2 cards instead of 1 if our hand is empty. If you get empty-handed while Asmodius is on the board, then his Draw 7 ability can actually exile 14 cards, since you can make each card draw go through both replacement effects. If you want some cool ways to spice up your Asmodius deck, then try running some of these cards. Also, Asmodius just so happens to go super well in the 99 of another commander, Marisol the Pretender. Marisol lets you exile creatures and artifacts from your hand, and he gains all of their activated abilities. So if you use him to exile Asmodius, then Marisol will just gain the activated abilities but not the replacement effect, so you can start drawing cards like crazy. For our next commander, I decided to take one of the new legendary creatures that does a super powerful cool thing, and then focus on an almost insignificant part of its ability. Xanathar Guild Kingpin lets you look at the top card of an opponent's deck and then play cards from the top of that player's deck. Now playing cards from other people's decks is obviously the good part of this mechanic, but I decided to just focus on the fact that this card lets you look at the top card of other people's decks. It turns out that there are a ton of ways to synergize with that ability. The most straightforward one is Predict. Predict lets you guess a card and then make anybody mill a card. If they mill the card you guessed, then you draw 2 cards. So if you know what the top card of somebody's deck is, then this card becomes a 2-mana draw 2, which is pretty great. It gets even better though, because if you time it right, you can use Predict to mill a card from somebody's deck that you didn't want to play. The bad part about cards like Xanathar is that you tend to get stopped by lands. If the opponent that you chose has 2 lands on top of their deck, then you can play the first one, but then you'll get stuck on the second one. But Predict would let you mill that land and then keep going. There are several other cards that get much better if you happen to know what the top card of one of your opponent's decks is. Nascent Metamorph turns into the top creature of an opponent's deck whenever it attacks or blocks, which is usually way too random to be reliable. But if you're playing Xanathar and you happen to see that the top card of your opponent's deck is Blightsteel Colossus, then this guy will be the best 2-mana creature in history. Telemann Performance and Thought Dissector let you play a creature or artifact respectively from the top of someone else's deck, so they also get much better if you know what you're getting beforehand. But Tofu, even if we can see the top card of an opponent's deck, why would we play Telemann Performance when it's just a strictly worse version of Bribery?
All my life I've been searching for distractions. You were the best distraction, and now I don't even have you. Now I've got to go back to playing with the ordinary people. And it turns out you're ordinary, just like all of them.
I'm not mad if you asked that question, just disappointed. Moving on, there is one super janky mechanic that's only good if you know what the top card of your opponent's deck is, and that mechanic is Clash. Clash basically means you and your opponent both scry 1, and if the card you scryed had a higher CMC, then something cool happens. If Xanathar is your commander, then you can wait to play your Clash cards until you know that someone else has a land on top of their deck. This still might not make you win, because if you also hit a land, then the Clash is a tie and you don't get the bonus. But it does make your chances of winning much higher. Cards like Scattering Stroke, Hoarder's Greed, and Research the Deep are much better if you actually win your clashes. But my favorite Clash card is definitely Whirlpool Realm. This card is an unsummon, but if you win the Clash, you put the creature on top of its owner's deck. If you're playing Xanathar, then that means you can use the Whirlpool on a creature and then play the creature. Some of the cards I mentioned are definitely spicier than they are good, but if you want your Xanathar deck to be unique, then try splashing in some of these cards for some extra fun. The last commander we're going to look at today is Minsc Beloved Ranger. This guy makes a 1/1 hamster when you play him, and he can pay X mana to make any creature you control into an XX giant at sorcery speed. So the obvious way to build this commander is to just stuff your deck with creatures that you want to make bigger, and I definitely recommend doing that. I was honestly super disappointed by this commander at first, because Naya is one of my favorite color combinations, but Minsc seemed way too one-dimensional and boring to me, since it seemed like he only did one thing. But there are actually 3 other things that we can do with Minsc's ability that are all reasonably powerful, other than just making creatures big. First off, Minsc is technically a sack outlet because his ability doesn't say X can't be 0. You can pay 0 mana to make any of your creatures into a 0/0 giant and it'll just die. Since Minsk changes base power and toughness, this won't work if the creature has any +1/+1 counters or if you have an Anthem or something, but it can still be a really nice option. Feel free to throw cards like Arena Rector, Academy Rector, and Mist Hollow-Griffin into your deck, since you know that you'll have access to a sack outlet every game. Next up, Minsk's ability changes our creatures into giants, which is super useful in the right circumstances. Realm Cloaked Giant and Thundercloud Shaman are two creatures that become one-sided wraths if all of your creatures are giants. The best way to take advantage of this is by playing any Anthem, and then you can pay 0 mana to make all of your creatures into 0/0 giants, and they won't die because of your Anthem. This does slightly clash with the sack outlet thing we just talked about, because the Anthem will prevent you from sacking your creatures with Minsk, so there is a bit of a balancing act there that you need to be aware of. But even if you don't have an Anthem, you can still pay 1 mana per creature to make them all into giants. Sometimes we'll also want to make one of our giants, well, giant, and Minsk can help us with that as well. Fire Giant's Fury can be a huge one-shot burst of card draw if we play it on a big giant, and Surtland Flinger lets us fling a big giant at someone for double damage. And finally, Calamity Bear just doubles up all of our damage from giants, which can help in a lot of situations. The last cool thing about Minsk's ability is that it can cost 0 mana, and it doesn't make him tap. That means we can theoretically activate it infinite times. If we have a creature that for some reason doesn't die when we make it a 0/0, then we can keep activating Minsk's ability on it over and over again. Now this doesn't actually do anything, but it's still pretty cool that you get infinite activations. If only there was a card that benefited from infinite ability activations that don't actually do anything.
Anyone at all?
Me!
Anyone?
Oh, pick me! Oh, I know, me!
That's right, true fans of the Commander Tofu channel will remember the card Crackdown Construct from a couple videos ago. This creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn whenever we activate an ability of an artifact or creature that isn't a mana ability. If we use Minsk to make the construct into a 0/0, then it'll get a 1/1 buff, and because of how layers work, this buff applies on top of the base power and toughness. So the construct will end up being a 1/1. Then we just keep targeting it with Minsk, and we can stack on infinitely many +1/+1 buffs and swing at someone for 1 billion damage. So yeah, Minsk can make our creatures bigger, but he can also be a sack outlet, he can let us play giant tribal cards, and he can make an infinitely big Crackdown Construct. Overall, I'd say this is more than enough to make him an interesting commander. That's it for this video. I'll definitely make at least one more video on some of the other janky commander combos from this D&D set, so hit subscribe if you don't want to miss out. But for now, I think you know what time it is. It's trivia time. Our last question was about the card City in a Bottle, which kills every card originally printed in Arabian Nights. But there's exactly one card from that set that had been printed in an earlier set so it doesn't get destroyed by the bottle. So what is the one card from Arabian Nights that isn't affected by City in a Bottle? The answer is Mountain. Just Mountain. Obviously Mountain was printed in every set before Arabian Nights, but you might be wondering why the answer is just Mountain and not all of the basic lands. Well, that's because Mountain was the only basic land printed in Arabian Nights. Apparently WotC originally intended to put in all 5 basics, but then they changed their mind at the last second and took them all out, but I guess some intern just forgot to take out Mountain. Now for today's question. Xanathar belongs to a very exclusive group of commanders, and that group is commanders whose name starts with an X. There are only 6 other commanders throughout the history of Magic whose names start with an X, not counting the silver-bordered X. So today's question, for 1 tofu point, is name any other commander whose name starts with X. And if you can name all 6, then you get negative 20 tofu points because there is absolutely no way that you did it without cheating and looking them up. Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss the answer in the next video. Thanks for watching. Tofu out. But there are actually 3 other things that we can do with Minsk. Since Minsk can help with that, and Minsk can help us, then we can keep activating Minsk. If we use Minsk to get